This beautiful Wednesday afternoon. My name is Steph and I normally work at Melksham Library, but obviously like many other people I'm working from home at the moment, and I thought I'd just take a few minutes to share some poetry with you this afternoon. So I hope you're all sitting in a nice comfy chair somewhere. Maybe you've made yourself a cuppa. I've got my coffee here. And we've got a few, as I say, poems to share with you. I'm taking all the poetry I'll be reading today come from this book here, which is a collection of the nation's favourite comic poems. It was a BBC book. They had a kind of a survey of the nation's favourite poems in various genres, including comic poems, and that's what I'm going to be reading through today. So if you're all settled, ready, I'm going to start. And I'm going to start with this one, which is by Lewis Carroll. As you know, Lewis Carroll, famous for writing Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, but he did a number of wonderful poetry too, and this is Father William. "You are old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white. And yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right?" "In my youth," Father William replied to his son, "I feared it might injure the brain, but now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again." "You are old," said the youth, "as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that?" "In my youth," said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, "I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple." "You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" "In my youth," said his father, "I took to the law and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life." "You are old," said the youth. "One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever?" "I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough," said his father. "Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs." I think the old father really told his son where to go. You could just hear him say, "You young whippersnapper." I'm going to move on now. I'm going to do another one from Edward Lear. Edward Lear, as you probably know, is famous for lots of nonsense limericks, and of course particularly famous for The Owl and the Pussycat. But this afternoon I'm going to read you another one of his, which is The Pobble Who Has No Toes. And just imagine yourself sitting by the sea, by the Bristol Channel maybe, with a gentle breeze and the sunlight glistening on the waves as I read this to you. "The pobble who has no toes had once as many as we. When they said some day you may lose them all, he replied, 'Fish fiddle-de-dee.' And his Aunt Jobiska made him drink lavender water tinged with pink. For she said, 'The world in general knows there's nothing so good for a pobble's toes.' The pobble who has no toes swam across the Bristol Channel. But before he set out, he wrapped his nose in a piece of scarlet flannel. For his Aunt Jobiska said, 'No harm can come to his toes if his nose is warm.' And it's perfectly known that a pobble's toes are safe, provided he minds his nose." The pobble swam fast and well, and when boats or ships came near him, he tinkledy-binkledy-winkled a well, so that all the world would hear him. And all the sailors and admirals cried when they saw him nearing the further side, He has gone to fish for his Aunt Jopisca's runcible cat with crimson whiskers. But before he touched the shore of the Bristol Channel, a sea-green porpoise carried away his wrapper of scarlet flannel. And when he came to observe his feet, formerly garnished with toes so neat, his face at once became forlorn on perceiving that all his toes were gone. And nobody ever knew, from that dark day to the present, whatso had taken the pobble's toes in a matter so far from pleasant. Whether the shrimps or crawfish grey or crafty mermaids stole them away, nobody knew and nobody knows how the pobble was robbed of twice 5 toes. The pobble, who has no toes, was placed in a friendly bark, and they rowed him back and carried him up to his Aunt Jopisca's park. And she made him a feast at his earnest wish of eggs and buttercups fried with fish. And she said, "It's a fact the whole world knows that pobbles are happier without their toes." It ended really nice. Aunt Jopisca is someone who just feels like she's a positive person who puts a positive spin on everything. And I think we need that kind of positive spin right now at the moment, being shut indoors and not being able to see some of our loved ones. But I'm going to turn now to something a little bit darker, a bit scarier and creepier. And it's actually by W.S. Gilbert, who you probably know from his work with Gilbert and Sullivan, the joint pair who worked on many comedy musicals. But they did also work separately. And Gilbert, of course, was the lyricist. And so he wrote a number of poems. And the poem I'm going to read now is The Nightmare. So now I want you to picture yourself lying in bed at night. It's dark and that's around you. When you're lying awake with a dismal headache and repose is tabooed by anxiety, I conceive you may use any language you choose to indulge in without impropriety. For your brain is on fire, the bedclothes conspire of usual slumber to plunder you. First your counterpane goes and uncovers your toes, and your sheet slips demurely from under you. Then the blanketing tickles, you feel like mixed pickles, so terribly sharp is the pricking. And you're hot and you're cross and you tumble and toss till there's nothing twixt you and the ticking. Then the bedclothes all creep to the ground in a heap and you pick 'em all up in a tangle. Next your pillow resigns and politely declines to remain at its usual angle. Well, you get some repose in the form of a doze with hot eyeballs and head ever aching. But you're slumbering teems with such horrible dreams that you'd very much better be waking. For you dream you are crossing the channel and tossing about in a steamer from Harwich, which is something between a large bathing machine and a very small second-class carriage. And you're given a treat, penny ice and cold meat, to a party of friends and relations. They're a ravenous horde, and they all came on board at Sloane Square and South Kensington stations. And bound on that journey you find your attorney, who started that morning from Devon. He's a bit undersized, and you don't feel surprised when he tells you he's only 11. Well, you're driving like mad with this singular lad. By the by, the ship's now a four-wheeler. And you're playing round games, and he calls you bad names when you tell him that ties pay the dealer. But this you can't stand, so you throw up your hand, and you find you're as cold as an icicle. In your shirt and your socks, the black silk with gold clocks, crossing Salisbury Plain on a bicycle. And he and the crew are on bicycles too, which they somehow or other invested in, and he's telling the tars or the particulars of a company he's interested in. It's a scheme of devices to get at low prices all goods from cough mixtures to cables, which tickled the sailors by treating retailers as though they were all vegetables. You get a good spadesman to plant a small tradesman, first take off his boots with a boot tree, and his legs will take root, and his fingers will shoot, and they'll blossom and bud like a fruit tree. From the greengrocer tree you get grapes and green peas, cauliflower, pineapple and cranberries, while the pastry cook plant cherry brandy will grant, apple puffs and three corners and banberries. The shares are a penny, and ever so many are taken by the Rothschild and Baring, and just as a few are allotted to you, you awake with a shudder, despairing. You're a regular wreck with a crick in your neck, and no wonder you snore, for your head's on the floor, and you've needles and pins from your soles on your shins, and your flesh is a creep, for your left leg's asleep, and you've cramp in your toes, and a fly on your nose, and some fluff in your lung, and a feverish tongue, and a thirst that's intense, and a general sense that you haven't been sleeping in clover. But the darkness has passed, and it's daylight at last. And the night has been long, ditto, ditto, my song. And thank goodness they're both of them over. I think that's a poem to reread and really take in, because it's really building on how dreams can jump from one thing to another. So they're on a boat, and then they're on bicycles, and then in a car. And I think it's one you could maybe want to revisit yourself sometime. I'm going to finish now on one more, and I'm going to go back to Lewis Carroll, a popular poet, and I'm going to do The Walrus and the Carpenter, which of course was made famous in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it was retailed by the Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And so I'm going to finish, as I say, The Walrus and the Carpenter, which always gives me a little bit of a shiver at the end, I'll be honest. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but not a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed then, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin the feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said, I deeply sympathise. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. Can't help but feel a bit sorry for the oysters. But there you go. That's my 4 songs for today, taken from this book, Nation's Favourite Comic Poems. Maybe you've got some favourite poems that you'd like to share with us. So do post us or message us with some of your favourite poems. We'd really love to hear from you. But I'm going to say goodbye now. It's been great. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed your tea or coffee. And we look forward to seeing you again at some point in the next few weeks. Do check out our Facebook pages. Across the Wiltshire County, there are going to be a number of things being streamed live. And do join us if something takes your fancy. But bye for now. Enjoy the rest of the day.